You know that feeling when you start a movie, just the first few frames, and you instantly know the rules of the world you're entering? That instant download of expectations that tells your brain, okay, this is going to be tense or this is going to be funny.
That's the emotional contract. It's this unspoken agreement between the filmmaker and you, the audience.
Mm.
And that invisible force is, well, it's genre theory. It's the framework that structures every single creative decision, right down to the color palette, and maybe, most critically, the music.
That's right. And the way a filmmaker chooses to honor or even subvert that expectation is exactly what we're focused on today. We are doing a deep dive into the building blocks of cinema. Our source material gives us this really clear roadmap, the 12 basic film genres. But our mission here is to show you how understanding this system is the crucial guide filmmakers use, especially when they need to pick the perfect score to absolutely nail the mood.
Yeah, and this dive is for you if you want to quickly get a handle on how films are categorized, why those categories matter beyond just a label, and how filmmakers deliberately use all this to craft that, that truly immersive emotional experience you feel when you're watching. It's kind of a shortcut to understanding the strategy behind the camera.
So let's unpack this. Our audience already knows what a film genre is. It's a category. But what's more interesting is what that genre does. I mean, what function does it serve as a tool to communicate with the audience?
It functions as a really powerful shorthand. Genres classify films based on these shared characteristics, right?
Hmm.
Narrative conventions, themes, visual styles. It just lets you know immediately if you should be expecting a tragedy or a triumph.
And even though we talk about genre as one single label, like calling something a Western, it's actually the combination of four fundamental elements that have to align perfectly to establish that identity. It's a fantastic analytical tool.
Absolutely. The four elements really define the DNA of the genre. So let's look at the first two: narrative structure and themes.
Narrative is the backbone. It's the plot, the characters, the specific setting, the where and the when, and the central conflict. So if we take a film like Dune, the narrative is simple. A chosen son goes to a hostile planet and has to face betrayal.
But the themes are what give it depth and push it into a specific genre sphere. The themes in Dune are all about power, ecology, prophecy. That's the underlying message and, the philosophical weight the characters are carrying.
Then we move on to the third element, visual style. This is where the budget and all the aesthetic choices come into play. Cinematography, the lighting, the angles, the editing, and the use of special effects. Dune has that distinct, desaturated, almost monumental visual style that tells you it's a serious epic.
And the fourth element, the one that kind of glues everything together, is tone. That's the overall atmosphere, the intended emotional impact, and how those genre conventions are used. Is the film hopeful? Is it bleak? Sarcastic? The tone of Dune is solemn and grand, which just reinforces that epic nature.
So if we formalize that a bit, the source offers a sort of academic equation. Story plus plot plus character plus setting equals genre.
It's a bit of a reductive formula, but it's useful for a quick analysis. What's really fascinating, though, is how our source emphasizes that genre isn't decided by some top-down committee. It emerges organically through industry practices, critical consensus, and just how the audience reacts. It's a consensus, not a decree.
Which explains the difference between a broad genre and a really tight subgenre. So genre is the umbrella, like horror. If we look under that umbrella, what's the distinction for the filmmaker?
The subgenre is a specialized category with much tighter conventions. So within horror, you get the very defined rules of a slasher film or the unique visual language of found footage. They satisfy the core requirements of horror, but they use a very specific, almost restrictive playbook.
And the interesting note here is that some subgenres, like film noir from the 40s with its moral ambiguity, low-key lighting, that cynical tone, they become so distinctive and influential that they are now often referred to as a genre in their own right, which just shows how this whole system is constantly updating itself.
Exactly. The system is always adapting as new stories get told and our expectations evolve.
Okay, let's jump into the foundational structure. Our source outlines 12 basic genres that really underpin modern storytelling. We're going to run through the first 6 of these pretty quickly, focusing on how their emotional requirement dictates their musical needs. Let's start with the genres that are heavily reliant on tension and psychological mood.
First up, thriller. This is all about suspense, tension, and paranoia, often involving crime, espionage, or conspiracy. The musical roadmap here is absolutely crucial. The score has to create unease and continuous anticipation. This is where you hear dissonant melodies, a building tempo, and that psychological impact of like high register strings, that metallic scrape that tells your brain something is wrong even when the screen is calm.
Right. And then moving to horror.
Yeah.
While the thriller wants you uneasy, horror wants to disturb and frighten you outright.
Exactly. The music just escalates the threat. We move past general unease to outright terrifying soundscapes. This demands intensely dissonant harmonies, the use of silence followed by a sudden loud noise to maximize the jump scare, and a perpetually slow, grinding tempo that's just designed to build dread. Think sound design that's blending with the music to make the world feel actively hostile.
Okay, next, the sensory overload. Action. Fast-paced, explosive, focusing on stunts and danger, from spy films to superhero epics.
Action scores have to be intensely energetic. They need a strong, propulsive beat and driving rhythms. It's often about heavy rhythmic percussion and these soaring brass sections, what we call a heroic melody, to enhance that high-octane feeling and translate physical force into sound. The rhythmic complexity of the music needs to mirror the choreography on screen.
Let's shift to sci-fi. So exploring speculative futures or alternate realities, dystopian or space opera.
Sci-fi demands the futuristic and the unknown in its music, so the score needs to be heavily electronic experimental, relying on synthesized sounds and often using really unusual rhythms and musical structures to create that sense of advanced technology or the deep, cold vacuum of space. It's the total opposite of the organic sound you'd find in, say, a historical drama.
Related, but very different, is fantasy. This genre explores magical or supernatural elements, like high fantasy or sword and sorcery.
Fantasy music is magical, ethereal, otherworldly. It relies on a powerful sense of wonder. So instead of cold electronics, we often hear lush orchestral arrangements, sometimes with unique or antique instruments like hammered dulcimers or period flutes to evoke that feeling of timeless, living magic.
And finally, for this first batch, the Western, defined by the vastness of the American frontier, featuring cowboys, justice, and that existential loneliness.
Oh, the music here has to communicate an epic, heroic senses scale. It needs a sweeping melody to evoke the vastness of the landscape and a powerful marching rhythm that speaks of travel and perseverance. I mean, you think about Ennio Morricone, that iconic whistling, the raw sound of an electric guitar, the massive string sections. That's the sound of the frontier translated into pure music.
Now, we mentioned there are 12 core genres. We've just analyzed the 6 that rely most heavily on tension and mood, but we can't ignore the other half. Romance, comedy, drama, apocalypse, martial arts, and sports. How does the music roadmap change for these?
Well, these 6 often rely on emotional clarity rather than psychological manipulation. For comedy and romance, the music needs to be harmonious and melodic. It often uses major keys and uplifting arrangements to communicate happiness and safety. Drama scores are generally more subtle, focusing on thematic motifs tied to character arcs.
And for martial arts and sports, they seem to share a characteristic with action.
Precisely. They rely on high energy, driving rhythms to emphasize physical prowess and competition. The score acts as a motivator. It demands strong beats, syncopated percussion. On the other hand, apocalypse films often fall back into the tension requirements of thriller and horror, using sparse, broken soundscapes to reflect societal collapse.
That breakdown shows perfectly how the genre dictates the required emotional feeling. And that leads directly to the core lesson here. Genre theory isn't just a label on a streaming service. It gives you a set of specific, practical instructions for execution.
That's the critical insight. Music is the one element that can instantly validate or completely derail a film's genre because it determines the mood and emotional response faster than any dialogue or visual. Genre theory becomes this rigorous framework filmmakers use to select a score that feels authentic and deeply immersive to you.
And our source provided a fantastic practical checklist of 5 tips that filmmakers use when they're trying to nail that score. Let's dig into the first piece of advice. Consider the genre conventions.
This is step 1. You have to research the typical musical elements associated with the genre just to understand audience expectations. What instruments are common? What are the recurring harmonic structures? You have to satisfy that baseline expectation first. If you're doing a spy thriller, the audience expects some form of brass or a driving jazz motif. If you ignore that, you risk alienating them before the story even starts.
But respecting conventions doesn't mean just mimicking them mindlessly. The second tip, think about the tone, seems to override the convention if the tone demands something different.
Absolutely. The music must always complement the overall atmosphere. So if you're making a horror film that's also a dark comedy, you might use dissonant melodies, but you might layer them with an inappropriately whimsical instrument like a ukulele to signal that tonal complexity. If the film is purely romantic, the music must be harmonious and consistently uplifting. The tone dictates the specific application of the convention.
The third piece of advice is all about synchronization. Pay attention to the pacing. It's not just about what the music sounds like, but when it appears.
Timing is everything. For fast-paced sequences, you need tracks with a strong, rapid beat and driving rhythm to create urgency. Conversely, you have to use suspenseful music, not just when something scary is happening, but during the quiet transitional moments to carefully build tension, making the audience wait for that release. The absence of music, or its sudden appearance, is just as strategic as the music itself.
The fourth tip is where the creativity really starts to flow. Experiment with different musical styles. I mean, if genre is a strict roadmap, why encourage breaking the mold?
Because if you follow the map perfectly every single time, you just get cliché. Filmmakers are encouraged not to be afraid to find unique combinations. Think about using 1950s rock and roll in a medieval setting, or heavy metal in a sci-fi space battle. You have to evaluate the impact on the audience experience. The risk is high, but the reward is a score that feels completely original, even within a familiar genre.
And finally, the practical homework. Listen to music from other films in your genre.
Right. Gather inspiration by analyzing successful scores. Identify effective techniques, not just the tunes, but how the composer used specific instruments to evoke specific emotions. But the key is being mindful of overused or predictable elements. You analyze the past to innovate for the future and avoid becoming a cliché yourself.
These 5 steps really transform genre theory from academic categories into a rigorous checklist for emotional design. But as cinema evolves, those genre boundaries are constantly blurring, which brings us to the rise of hybridity.
Hybrid genres are pretty much the norm now. These are films that deliberately combine elements from 2 or more established genres. Think of an action comedy like Deadpool or, I don't know, a Western set in space.
So why are hybrid genres so popular now? And why do so many of the highest grossing films fall into this category?
Our source notes that many of the biggest blockbusters are hybrids action-adventure combined with sci-fi or fantasy. They reflect the evolution of audience sophistication. You know the rules so well that you crave stories that challenge those traditional boundaries. The hybrid allows a filmmaker to deliver the comfort of a familiar genre while layering on innovative themes or unexpected tones from another.
So instead of being handcuffs, genre conventions are actually powerful creative tools. We see directors using them in really complex ways. First, through subversion.
Subversion is all about setting up an expectation only to deliberately break it for thematic effect. A classic example is using horror conventions, the isolated setting, the growing dread, not just for cheap scares, but to explore biting social commentary, like in Get Out. You activate the audience's genre expectation, and then you twist that emotional response toward a deeper message.
Okay, and the second technique is deconstruction.
Deconstruction is analyzing and commenting on the very tropes while you're still using them. Unforgiven is a great example of this. It uses the visual language of the Western, the dusky towns, the gunfights, but it strips away the heroism and the romanticism, showing the violence and loneliness for what it really is. It's meta-awareness built right into the narrative.
And the third approach is elevation.
Elevation is taking what might traditionally be seen as a low or B-movie genre, a standard superhero premise, maybe, and executing it with absolutely exceptional craft, complex moral storytelling, and high production quality. When a director treats a superhero film with the seriousness and thematic density of a classic drama, they are elevating that genre.
And this whole movement reflects a cycle we've seen historically. Our source points out that the 1930s and 50s were the golden age of clearly defined genres, the westerns, the musicals. Then the 60s and 70s brought that period of deconstruction, where filmmakers began questioning the mythology.
And today, the digital age and streaming platforms have accelerated hybridization intensely. We have a constant demand for niche content, which pushes creators to blend genres to offer you something familiar yet new every single week. The genre landscape is fundamentally more complicated than it was 50 years ago.
This deep dive really shows that film genre is far more than just a simple category. It is a complex system defined by its narrative, its style, its themes, and its tone. It provides a clear map for both creation and viewing, and understanding the system is crucial for fully appreciating the immersive experience of cinema and how those emotional strings are strategically pulled.
And that leads us to our final thought for you to consider. The source makes this powerful claim. The exact number of genres is impossible to pin down. It says that the taxonomy of film genres resembles a living language, constantly growing and evolving in response to what we, as a culture, are currently worried about or obsessed with.
So if genre reflects cultural anxieties and changing times, if the Western reflected the anxiety of civilization versus nature, and sci-fi reflected fears of technology, what new hybrid genre, one that currently doesn't have a fixed name, do you think is emerging right now from the films and shows you're watching? One that's trying to fulfill a new, unstated cultural need?
That's something worth watching out for the next time you press play.
Yeah.
The future of cinema is probably being embedded in a niche hybrid right now.